And it didn't begin with a headline. It began with a silence thick, suffocating, and impossible to ignore inside a private chamber at Kensington Palace. Those who witnessed Prince William that evening say his composure shattered in a way never seen before. And standing across from him was Queen Camilla, holding something that should never have resurfaced. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The meeting itself, quote, was never meant to exist in any official record, at least not in the form it took that evening. It was arranged quietly, with a level of discretion that even seasoned palace staff found unusual. Senior advisors were called in without explanation, their schedules cleared with little notice, their presence requested under the kind of urgency that signals something far beyond routine royal business. And at the center of it all stood Prince William, not as the composed future king the world had come to recognize, but as a son unknowingly stepping into a moment that would challenge everything he believed he understood about his past. Across from him, Queen Camilla carried herself with a calm that many later described as unsettling, as though she had already accepted the consequences of what she was about to reveal. What followed, according to those familiar with the inner workings of the palace, was not a discussion in the traditional sense. It was a disclosure deliberate, controlled, and impossible to reverse. Reports began to circulate quietly at first that the conversation had centered around a deeply personal revelation tied to Diana, Princess of Wales. Not a public memory, not a widely known chapter of her life, but something far more intimate, something preserved in private, hidden away from the official narratives that had defined her legacy for decades. The word that surfaced again and again in those early whispers was simple, yet loaded with implication: letters. Letters that, by all accounts, were never meant to be seen. Letters that existed outside the carefully curated archives of royal history. Letters that carried within them the unfiltered voice of a woman whose life had already been dissected, interpreted, and retold countless times. And yet, these particular documents, if the reports are to be believed, had remained untouched by public scrutiny, shielded from the mechanisms that typically govern the preservation of royal memory. Their very existence raised questions that few within the palace were prepared to confront. How had they remained hidden for so long? Who had safeguarded them? And perhaps most unsettling of all, why were they being revealed now? Those present in the room would later describe a shift in the atmosphere the moment these letters were mentioned. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible, but it carried a weight that could not be ignored. Prince William, known for his measured demeanor, reportedly struggled to maintain the composure expected of him. Insiders would later use phrases like shaken to the core and visibly overwhelmed descriptions that stand in stark contrast to the controlled image he has maintained throughout his public life. This was not the reaction of a future monarch navigating a political challenge. This was the reaction of a son confronted with the possibility that his understanding of his mother's story of Diana, Princess of Wales's story, might not be as complete as he had always believed. In the immediate aftermath of the meeting, the palace moved swiftly, almost instinctively, to contain what had transpired. Aides were instructed to remain silent, their usual channels of communication abruptly restricted. Conversations that might have once flowed freely were suddenly cut short, replaced by a tension that lingered in the corridors long after the meeting had concluded. It was an unusual level of secrecy, even by royal standards, and it did not go unnoticed by those accustomed to the rhythms of palace life. Something had shifted, and everyone seemed to understand that whatever had been revealed carried implications far beyond the walls of that private chamber. Outside, the world remained unaware, at least for the moment. There were no official statements, no carefully worded briefings to the press, no attempt to shape the narrative before it could take on a life of its own. Instead, there was silence, a deliberate, calculated silence that only deepened the sense of unease. And within that silence, the fragments of what had occurred began to surface, carried not through formal channels but through whispers, through subtle changes in behavior, through the kind of unspoken signals that those closest to the institution have learned to read. Because what had been introduced into that room was not just a set of documents. It was a possibility that the past, long thought to be settled, was still capable of shifting beneath the surface. A possibility that the story of Diana, Princess of Wales, one of the most scrutinized figures in modern history, still held secrets waiting to be uncovered. And for Prince William, that possibility carried a weight that was both deeply personal and profoundly public, a tension that would only grow as the implications of that meeting began to unfold, because what Camilla revealed wasn't just emotional, it threatened to rewrite the very history William had spent his life protecting. For decades, it, quote, was believed that every private word Diana, Princess of Wales, left behind had been carefully archived or quietly buried. But whispers now suggest that a hidden collection of letters existed outside official royal records, and somehow, they ended up in Queen Camilla's possession. What makes this revelation so unsettling is not just the existence of these letters, but the implication that an entire layer of Diana's voice may have been deliberately kept outside the reach of history. For years, a narrative surrounding her life has been shaped through carefully selected interviews, authorized biographies, and fragments of correspondence that were deemed appropriate for public understanding. But now, according to those familiar with the situation, these newly surfaced letters belong to a different category altogether, unfiltered, unedited, and untouched by the mechanisms that typically define royal memory. They are said to have been written during the most turbulent years of her life, in moments when the weight of expectation collided with deeply personal struggles, leaving behind words that were never intended to be scrutinized beyond a trusted circle. That alone would be enough to raise questions. But what has truly unsettled those within the palace is the suggestion that these letters were never formally recorded, never logged into the structured system that preserves royal documents. Instead, they appear to have existed in a kind of shadow archive passed quietly from one hand to another, removed from official oversight, protected by silence rather than protocol. It introduces a possibility that few are comfortable acknowledging, that not everything tied to Diana's legacy was preserved through institutional channels. Some of it, it seems, may have been deliberately kept outside the system altogether. And if that is true, then the implications stretch far beyond a single discovery, because these letters are rumored to contain deeply personal reflections, thoughts on her marriage, her isolation, and the emotional toll of life within an institution that often demanded more than it gave. There is a growing belief among insiders that what these letters reveal could challenge long-held assumptions, not by rewriting history entirely, but by adding layers that were never meant to be exposed. Layers that complicate the narrative, layers that resist simplification, layers that, once acknowledged, cannot simply be ignored. The question of how these documents moved, quote, through unofficial channels only deepens the mystery. There are whispers of private exchanges, of trusted intermediaries, of moments when personal loyalty took precedence over institutional duty. No single account fully explains their journey. And perhaps that is what makes the situation so difficult to contain. Because without a clear record, without a definitive path, the letters exist in a space that defies control. They are not bound by the rules that govern official archives. And as a result, they carry a kind of unpredictability that the palace is not designed to handle. This unpredictability has triggered a quiet but unmistakable sense of unease. If these letters were indeed kept hidden, then it suggests a deliberate choice was made at some point either to protect Diana's privacy or to shield the institution from what those words might reveal. And now, with their sudden emergence, that choice is being called into question, not publicly, not yet, but internally, where the, quote, weight of such decisions is felt most acutely, because the preservation of history within the monarchy has always been as much about control as it is about memory. What is included matters. What is excluded matters even more. And that is where the tension begins to build. Because if these letters exist outside the official record, then they represent more than just personal correspondence. They represent a version of the past that was never fully acknowledged, a version that could disrupt the carefully maintained balance between truth and legacy, a version that raises uncomfortable questions about what else might have been set aside, what else might still be waiting beyond the reach of official documentation. For Prince William, this is not an abstract concern. It is deeply personal, because any new insight into his mother's private world carries with it the potential to reshape not only public understanding, but his own. And as these whispers grow louder, as the existence of these, quote, letters becomes harder to dismiss, the situation moves beyond speculation into something far more consequential. Because once the possibility has been introduced, it cannot simply be undone. It lingers. It expands. It demands answers. And if these letters were hidden for a reason, then the question becomes unavoidable: who kept them, and why reveal them now? Those present in the room described the moment as unforgiving. Without warning, Queen Camilla reportedly disclosed details from the, quote, letters details so raw, so deeply personal, that even seasoned royal aides were left stunned into silence. It did not unfold gradually. There was no careful lead-in, no attempt to soften the weight of what was about to be revealed. According to those familiar with the exchange, Camilla moved with a certainty that caught everyone off guard, as though the decision had already been made long before anyone else realized what was at stake. The letters, those same documents that had lingered in Quatepers just hours before, were no longer abstract, no longer distant possibilities. They had become immediate, undeniable, and impossible to ignore. And with that shift came a tension that settled heavily over the room, the kind that signals a moment from which there is no easy return. Reports suggest that Camilla did more than simply acknowledge the existence of these letters. She referenced them. Specific passages, carefully chosen, were brought into the conversation, each one carrying a, quote, weight that went far beyond the words themselves. There are claims that these excerpts revealed reflections from Diana, Princess of Wales, that had never been part of the public narrative, thoughts shaped during periods of emotional strain, moments when the distance between personal truth and public image became almost impossible to reconcile. If those claims hold any truth, then what was introduced in that room was not just new information, but a challenge to the story that has been told, repeated, and accepted for decades. For Prince William, the impact was immediate and deeply personal. This was not a distant historical debate or a question of interpretation. This was his mother's voice, unexpected, unfiltered, and presented in a context he had not chosen. Insiders describe a visible shift in his demeanor, a moment where the steady composure he is known for gave way to something far more human, far more vulnerable. Because what he was hearing was not just a reinterpretation of events. It was the possibility that there were parts of Diana's experience that had remained hidden, even from those closest to her legacy. And in that moment, the past and present collided with a force that few could have anticipated. The carefully maintained boundaries between what was known and what was unknowable began to blur, creating a tension that extended beyond the immediate conversation. This was no longer about a set of letters or the circumstances of their preservation. It was about, quote, the fragility of the narrative itself, about how easily it could shift when confronted with new fragments of truth. The room, by all accounts, became a space where history was no longer fixed, where the lines between certainty and doubt were suddenly open to question. That is what has led many to question Camilla's motives, because timing, in a setting like this, is never accidental. Why now? Why bring these details forward at a moment when the balance within the royal family is already under constraint? Some interpretations suggest it was an attempt to confront unresolved truths, to bring clarity where ambiguity had long persisted. Others, however, see it differently. They see calculation. They see a move designed to shift the narrative, to introduce uncertainty where there had once been stability, to redefine the terms of a story that has shaped public perception for generations. There is also the possibility that this was not intended as a confrontation at all, but as something far more complex, a moment where personal history, institutional memory, and present-day dynamics intersected in a way that could not be easily controlled. Because once those words were spoken, once those passages were introduced, the conversation could no longer remain contained within the walls of that room. It carried implications that extended outward, touching on questions of legacy, trust, and the delicate balance between private truth and public identity. And that is where the true weight of the moment begins to reveal itself. Because what happened in that room was not just a disclosure. It was a shift, a turning point that has the potential to reshape not only how Diana's story is understood, but how it is remembered moving forward. For William, that realization comes with a burden that is both deeply personal and profoundly public, a tension that cannot be easily resolved. Because once the past begins to move, once it reveals new layers, it does not simply settle back into place. It demands to be acknowledged. It demands to be understood. And perhaps most difficult of all, It demands to be reconciled with everything that came before. But what hit William hardest wasn't just what was said, it was what it implied about the past he thought he understood. For Prince William, the past has always been something to honor, not reopen. But in that moment, the carefully preserved memory of his mother began to fracture under the weight of revelations he was never prepared to hear. For years, William has carried a quiet, unwavering commitment to protect the legacy of Diana, Princess of Wales, from distortion, from speculation, from the relentless pull of narratives that often sought to reshape her story. It was never just about public image. It was about something deeper, something more personal, a sense of duty rooted not in protocol but in memory. He had built his understanding of her life piece by piece, holding on to what was certain, what was shared, what could be, trusted. And in doing so, he had created a version of the past that offered stability, something firm to stand on amid the constant noise that surrounded her name. But now, that foundation was shifting. Not collapsing all at once, but moving in a way that could not be ignored, because what he was being confronted with was not an external interpretation or a distant analysis. It was the possibility of her own words, private, unfiltered, and presented in a way that challenged the balance he had spent so long maintaining. Reports suggest that in those moments, William struggled to reconcile what he was hearing with what he had always believed, not because he doubted her, but because the context had changed, the meaning had shifted. And with that shift came a sense of uncertainty that was both unfamiliar and deeply unsettling. Those present have described a visible effort to maintain composure, a controlled stillness that masked the emotional weight of the situation. But beneath that, surface, there are indications that the impact ran far deeper, because grief, when left unresolved, does not disappear. It settles. It waits. And when something disturbs it, when new information forces it back into the present, it does not return gently. It arrives with the same intensity, the same questions, the same longing for clarity that may never come. For William, this was not just about revisiting the past. It was about confronting the possibility that parts of it had remained incomplete. Quote, that there were layers to his mother's experience that he had never fully seen. That realization carries a weight that extends beyond personal emotion, because William is not only a son, he is the future of an institution that depends, in many ways, on the stability of its narrative. The story of Diana, Princess of Wales, has become part of that narrative, woven into the broader identity of the monarchy itself. To question it, even privately, introduces a tension between two roles that are difficult to separate. On one side, there is the responsibility to uphold continuity, to preserve the image that has been carefully maintained. On the other, there is the need to understand, to seek truth, even when that truth complicates what has already been accepted. And it is within that tension that the emotional conflict begins to take shape. Because understanding does not always bring resolution. Sometimes, it brings more questions. Questions about what was known and what was hidden. Questions about who decided what should be preserved and what should remain unseen. Questions that do not have easy answers, but refuse to be dismissed. For William, this is not a theoretical struggle. It is immediate, personal, and deeply tied to his sense of identity, not just as a royal, but as a son trying to navigate a legacy that continues to evolve in ways he cannot fully control. There is also a growing awareness, subtle but persistent, that some truths may never be fully revealed. That, even with these letters, even with these new fragments of understanding, there may always be parts of Diana's story that remain just out of reach. Not because they are deliberately hidden, but because they belong to moments that cannot be fully reconstructed, emotions that cannot be completely translated into words. And yet, the presence of these letters suggests that the past is not as settled as it once seemed, that it still holds the power to shift, to expand, to challenge what was once considered certain. For William, that is perhaps the most difficult realization of all, not the content of the letters, not the questions they raise, but the understanding that the story he has lived with, the one he has protected, is not fixed. It is still moving, still unfolding, still capable of revealing new dimensions. And as that realization begins to settle, it brings with it a sense of inevitability, because once the past begins to open, once it invites deeper examination, it can simply be closed again. It demands to be faced, to be understood, even if that understanding comes at a cost. And as the weight of those revelations settled in, it became clear this wasn't just about the past anymore. Within hours of the meeting, the machinery of the monarchy moved into overdrive. Silence was enforced. Access was restricted. And those closest to the situation were given one clear directive: contain this before it spirals beyond control. What followed was not chaos, but something far more calculated. The institution, long practiced in managing crises both public and private, shifted into a mode that insiders often describe as instinctive. Communication channels that typically operated with quiet efficiency were suddenly tightened, their flow narrowed to only the most essential exchanges. Conversations that might have once unfolded naturally were now measured, deliberate, and, in many cases, avoided altogether. It was as though an invisible line had been drawn, separating, quote, "can those who needed to know from those who did not," creating a controlled environment where information could be contained, at least in theory. Reports suggest that palace officials moved quickly to limit the spread of any details connected to the meeting. Not through overt declarations, but through subtle, unmistakable signals. Access to certain areas was quietly adjusted. Schedules were altered without explanation. Individuals known for their proximity to sensitive matters found themselves operating under new constraints, their usual freedoms replaced by a heightened awareness that something significant had shifted. It was not the kind of response reserved for routine matters. It was the kind of response that signals risk not just to individuals, but to the institution itself. At the center of this urgency was a growing concern about what might happen if the details of those letters and the conversations surrounding them were to reach beyond the walls of the palace. Because, quote, once something enters the public domain, it cannot be reclaimed. It cannot be reshaped with the same precision. It takes on a life of its own, influenced by interpretation, speculation, and the relentless pace of modern media. And for an institution that relies so heavily on controlled narratives, that possibility is not just uncomfortable, it is destabilizing. This is where the balance becomes most delicate. On one side, there is the principle of transparency, an expectation that has grown, quote, stronger in recent years as public scrutiny has intensified. On the other, there is the long-standing tradition of discretion, the understanding that not every detail is meant for public consumption. Navigating that balance requires more than policy. It requires judgment, timing, and an acute awareness of how even the smallest disclosure can shift perception in ways that cannot be undone. And in this case, that balance was under strain in a way that few had anticipated. Within the palace, there, quote, were indications of differing views on how to proceed. Some, it is said, favored a strategy of strict containment, limit the flow of information, maintain silence, allow the moment to pass without acknowledgement. Others, however, recognized the difficulty of sustaining that approach in a landscape where information rarely remains hidden for long. They understood that the absence of an official narrative can sometimes create a vacuum, one that is quickly filled by speculation. And speculation, quote, once it takes hold, can be far more difficult to manage than a carefully constructed statement. All of this unfolded against the backdrop of an ever-present reality: the media. The possibility that fragments of the story might begin to surface was not hypothetical. It was expected. Journalists, analysts, and observers, many with deep connections to the institution, are always attuned to shifts, to inconsistencies, to the subtle signs that something is unfolding beneath the surface. And when can those signs appear, they are followed. They are questioned. They are pieced together until a narrative begins to form, whether confirmed or not. That is what made the situation so precarious. Because despite every effort to contain it, despite every measure taken to control the flow of information, there was a growing sense that the story had already begun to move beyond the palace's reach. Not in full detail, not yet, but in fragments, whispers, observations, subtle changes that did not go unnoticed. And once those fragments exist, they create momentum, they invite curiosity, they demand attention. For those tasked with managing the institution's response, this was the challenge that loomed largest. Not just how to respond to what had happened, but how to respond to what might happen next. Because the moment the truth begins to surface, even in pieces, it becomes increasingly difficult to define its boundaries. It expands, it evolves, and it resists containment in ways that no Koan strategy can fully anticipate. But no matter how tightly the palace tried to seal it, the truth had already begun to surface, and it wasn't going away quietly. The British monarchy has always been built on carefully constructed narrative stories of duty, sacrifice, and continuity. But what happens when those narratives are suddenly challenged from within? For generations, the strength of the institution has not rested solely on tradition or ceremony, but on the careful shaping of its own story. And every chapter, every moment of triumph or hardship, has been woven into a larger narrative designed to endure. And within that narrative, the legacy of Diana, Princess of Wales, has held a unique and powerful place, one defined by compassion, resilience, and a connection with the public that transcended the boundaries of royalty itself. It is a legacy that has been protected, not just out of respect, but because it has become an integral part of how the monarchy understands itself in the modern era. But now, the emergence of these letters introduces a complication that cannot be easily resolved, because if they reveal new dimensions of Diana's experience, if they present thoughts and emotions that were never part of the public record, then they do more than add detail. They shift perspective. They invite reconsideration. And in doing so, they challenge the stability of a narrative that has long been treated as settled. This is not about discrediting what is known. It is about the realization that what is known may not be complete. And that realization carries consequences that extend far beyond personal memory. Public perception, once shaped, is not easily altered. It evolves slowly, influenced by new information, but also by the context in which that information is received. The monarchy has long understood this, which is why its approach to history has been so deliberate. What is shared, when it is shared, and how it is framed, these are not decisions made lightly. The Khan are part of a broader effort to maintain continuity, to ensure that the institution remains grounded even as the world around it changes. But when new elements emerge unexpectedly, without preparation or control, that balance is disrupted. The narrative becomes less certain, more open to interpretation, more vulnerable to the kind of scrutiny that can reshape it in unpredictable ways. This is where the tension between truth and legacy becomes most pronounced, because truth, in its purest form, does not always align with preservation. It does not always support the structures that have been built to contain it. Sometimes, it complicates them. Sometimes, it forces a reassessment that is uncomfortable, even destabilizing. And yet, to ignore it entirely carries its own risks. Because the absence of acknowledgement can create a different kind of uncertainty, one that invites speculation, that encourages doubt, that gradually erodes the very stability it seeks to protect. Within the palace, this tension is not theoretical. It is immediate, and it is deeply felt. There is an awareness that how this situation is handled will have implications not just for the present, but for the future. Because the monarchy is not only defined by its past, it is sustained by its ability to carry that past forward in a way that remains credible, meaningful, and relevant. If the narrative begins to fracture, if it loses coherence, then the impact is not confined to a single moment. It extends outward, influencing how the institution is perceived, how it is understood, and ultimately, how it is supported. And so, the stakes become clear. This is not just about a set of letters or the circumstances of their emergence. It is about the integrity of the story itself, about whether it can adapt to new information without losing its foundation, about whether it can absorb complexity without becoming unstable. These are questions that do not have simple answers, and they cannot be resolved quickly. They require careful consideration, measured response, and an understanding that every decision made now will shape what comes next. For figures like Prince William, who stand at the intersection of personal history and institutional responsibility, the weight of these questions is particularly significant. Because any shift in how Diana's legacy is understood inevitably becomes part of the future they are expected to lead. It is a reminder that the past is never entirely separate from the, can present, and that the way it is interpreted can influence the direction of everything that follows. As these implications begin to take shape, as the immediate shock gives way to deeper reflection, the situation moves beyond reaction into something more complex. It becomes a matter of strategy, of judgment, of deciding how to navigate a path where every option carries consequences. And in that space of uncertainty, where the past and future seem to converge, one question begins to stand out with increasing clarity, because as those implications began to take shape, one question lingered above all others: what happens next? In the days that followed, there were no statements, no clarifications, no denials, just silence, a silence so deliberate, it spoke louder than any official response ever could. It settled over the institution with a quiet intensity, shaping every interaction, every appearance, every carefully measured word that was not spoken. For an organization so deeply attuned to public perception, the absence of a response is never accidental. It is a decision, one that carries intention and consequence in equal measure. And in this case, that silence felt different, less like routine discretion, and more like a calculated pause, as though the weight of what had unfolded was still being measured behind closed doors. The refusal to address the situation publicly did not go unnoticed. In fact, it became the story itself. Observers who have long followed the rhythms of the monarchy began to recognize the pattern, or rather, the disruption of it. Normally, even the most sensitive matters are met with some form of acknowledgement, however restrained. A carefully worded statement, a subtle shift in messaging, something to anchor the narrative before it begins to drift. But here, there was nothing. And in that absence, speculation found space to grow. The media, as expected, began to fill that space. Not with certainty, but with questions persistent, probing, and impossible to ignore. Each fragment of information, each whispered detail, was examined, expanded, and connected to form a picture that remained incomplete yet increasingly compelling. Analysts debated the significance of the alleged letters, the timing of their emergence, and the implications for those at the center of it all. But without confirmation, every interpretation remained suspended between possibility and doubt, creating a tension that only deepened the intrigue. At the same time, attention shifted to what could be observed, however subtly. Public appearances, once routine, were now viewed through a different lens. A glance held a fraction longer than expected, a gesture that seemed slightly out of place. The smallest variations in demeanor became subjects of intense scrutiny, each one interpreted as a potential clue to what lay beneath the surface. For figures like Prince William, this level of attention is not new, but in this context, it carried a different weight. Because every expression, every movement, was now being read not just as a reflection of duty, but as a possible indication of something unresolved. Among royal watchers, the sense of curiosity began to shift into something more complex. It was no longer just about uncovering details. It was about understanding the silence itself. Why maintain it so completely? What purpose does it serve? There is a recognition, particularly among those familiar with the inner workings of the institution, that silence can be a powerful tool. It allows space for internal deliberation. It prevents premature conclusions. It maintains control in a situation where too much information, released too quickly, could create more instability than clarity. But silence also carries risk, because in the absence of a defined narrative, others will attempt to create one. And those narratives, once established, can be difficult to reshape. They take hold, influenced by perception rather than confirmation, and they can evolve in ways that are not easily guided. This is the balance the palace must navigate between withholding and revealing, between control and uncertainty. And in this moment it has chosen to hold back, to allow the situation to remain undefined, at least for now. Yet beneath that decision lies an unmistakable sense that something significant remains hidden, not necessarily in the sense of a single revelation waiting to be uncovered, but in the broader understanding that the full story has not yet surfaced. The letters, the meeting, the reactions, these are pieces of a larger picture, one that has yet to be fully assembled, and the silence, rather than closing that gap, seems to emphasize it, drawing attention to what is not being said, to what remains just beyond reach. For those watching closely, this creates a kind of quiet tension, a feeling that the situation is not resolved, but paused, that the story is still unfolding, even if it is doing so out of view, because silence, in a context like this, is rarely an ending. It is a space between moments, a holding point before something shifts again. And as that space continues to stretch, as the absence of answers becomes more pronounced, the sense of anticipation only grows stronger. Because sometimes, what isn't said carries far more weight than what is, and this silence was anything but empty. History has a way of resurfacing, especially the parts that were never meant to be seen. And now, with whispers of Diana's hidden, letters echoing through palace walls, the past is no longer content to remain buried. What began as a contained revelation has evolved into something far more difficult to define. The letters, once spoken of in hushed tones, now exist as a persistent question, unanswered, unresolved, and impossible to ignore. No one has publicly confirmed their full contents. No official account has been offered to frame their meaning, and yet, their presence alone has been enough to shift the atmosphere. Can introduce a sense of uncertainty that lingers just beneath the surface of everything that follows. Because the power of a secret does not always lie in what is known, but in what remains just out of reach. There is a growing belief that what has surfaced so far may only represent a fraction of a larger truth, that these letters are not isolated, but part of something more extensive, an untold chapter waiting, perhaps inevitably, to be uncovered. And with that belief comes a quiet but undeniable contention. Because if more exists, if additional revelations are still hidden within private collections or forgotten exchanges, then the story is far from complete. It is still unfolding, still evolving, still capable of reshaping the understanding of a legacy that has long been considered fixed. For Prince William, the emotional weight of that possibility does not simply fade with time, it lingers. It settles into the spaces between duty and memory, creating a tension that cannot be easily, resolved. Because this is not just about historical clarity, it is about personal connection, about the enduring presence of Diana, Princess of Wales, in a story that continues to evolve long after her voice was thought to have fallen silent. Each new fragment, each suggestion of undisclosed truth, carries with it the potential to reopen questions that were never fully answered, to revisit emotions that were never fully laid to rest. And within the royal family, that impact extends beyond any single individual. The balance between private truth and public legacy becomes increasingly fragile as new possibilities emerge. Because the monarchy does not exist in isolation, it exists in the space between what is lived and what is presented. And when that balance is disrupted, even subtly, the effects ripple outward. They influence perception. They shape interpretation. They redefine the boundaries between what belongs to history and what remains deeply personal. This is where the deeper contention begins to take hold. Because some stories are not meant to be contained, not indefinitely. They resist silence. They push against the structures designed to hold them in place. And over time, they find ways to resurface, not always in full, not always with clarity, but with enough presence to demand attention. The letters, whether fully revealed or not, have already crossed that threshold. They exist now in the collective awareness, no longer hidden, no longer entirely private. And once something reaches that point, it cannot simply be returned to obscurity. There is also a haunting realization that accompanies this shift, that even if the full truth were to emerge, it might not bring the resolution one expects. Because truth, especially in matters of personal history, does not always offer closure. Sometimes it complicates. Sometimes it deepens the sense of ambiguity rather than resolving it. And in a story as layered and emotionally charged as this, that possibility can be ignored. The past, once reopened, does not always settle neatly back into place. It changes the landscape, altering how everything that follows is understood. And so, what remains is not a conclusion, but a continuation. A sense that this moment, as significant as it is, may only represent the beginning of a larger unfolding. That the echoes of these letters will persist, influencing conversations, shaping perceptions, and quietly redefining a legacy that was never as fixed as it once seemed. Because history, when it resurfaces, does not do so gently. It arrives with weight, with presence, with a refusal to be dismissed. And in that refusal lies the understanding that some truths, no matter how deeply buried, will always find a way to be heard. Because in the end, the monarchy may control the narrative, but it can't always control the truth. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.